I'm 29 now. The thing I want to get off my chest started when I was 16, and it has not stopped living in my head since, so bear with me because there's a lot. My mom died when I was 15. It was her heart. Fast, nothing anybody planned for. My dad had already been gone a few years by then, so that left me with one option, and the option was my Aunt Lois, my mom's older sister. Lois took me in, and to be fair to the version of the story she tells at holidays, she did technically take me in. She also never once let me forget it. Here's the part that matters, and I need you to hold on to it because everything comes back to it. My grandfather, Lois's dad and my mom's dad, owned two small houses in the same town. Nothing fancy. One was the house Lois lived in, the other was a rental 2 streets over. When he died, he left things split in a way that Lois clearly expected to go differently. My mom got the rental house outright. Lois got the house she lived in. And because my mom was already sick when the paperwork was being sorted, she'd done something I didn't understand at the time. She put the rental house into an arrangement that named me, not Lois. Me, with my mom's longtime friend Nora as the trustee until I turned 25 because you obviously can't hand a house to a 15-year-old. Lois knew about the rental. She did not, I'm now certain, ever fully register that it wasn't hers to fold into everything I've given this family. To her, it was just the other house. The one that brought in rent, the one she managed and collected on and treated as part of her pile. Nora let her collect the rent for years because Nora is conflict avoidant to a fault and figured it kept the peace while I was a kid. That decision is going to matter later. So picture the house I actually grew up in from 15 to 18. Lois has 2 kids of her own, Dennis, a year older than me, and a daughter who moved out early and stayed out of all of this. So forget her. Dennis was the golden one. Dennis got the newer phone, Dennis got driven to practice, Dennis got the bedroom with the door that closed properly. I got the small room off the kitchen and a running tab of everything I supposedly cost her. She'd itemize it. Groceries, the water I used, the electricity. Like I was a tenant who was behind. I was a kid whose mom just died. Why did she treat me like that? I asked myself that for years, and I actually got the real answer. Straight from her, which I'll get to. The short version is that Lois genuinely believed my mother had been the favorite her whole life. Prettier, married better, and then, this was the unforgivable part in Lois's mind, got handed the rental house, the one with the income, while Lois got stuck with Dad's old place. She'd carried that resentment for decades, and then her sister died and dropped that sister's kid right into her lap. And I think every time she looked at me, she saw the sister who took what should have been mine. She said almost exactly that once during the worst of it. The day it blew up, I was 16, about 4 months after moving in, right after Christmas. I'd found out from Nora, who visited sometimes and clearly felt guilty, that the rent from the other house was legally supposed to be tied to me and my future, not to Lois's grocery runs. I was 16 and dumb, and I brought it up at the kitchen table like an idiot. I said something like, "Isn't that house supposed to be for me?" That's all. I didn't demand anything. I just asked. Lois came apart. She told me I was an ungrateful little parasite, that I'd shown up with nothing and would leave with nothing, that my mother had filled my head with lies about being owed something. She said the line I've never forgotten, that I was worthless, that I'd end up exactly like my father, and that I would die alone with no one who'd take me in like she foolishly had. Dennis stood in the doorway agreeing with her, adding his own commentary about how I acted like the world owed me, how his mom worked herself sick for me, and I repaid her by making accusations. Nora was there too, and she tried to say something about the house arrangement, tried to explain it wasn't an accusation, it was just true. And Lois told her to stay out of family business and that if Nora loved that house so much she could take me with her. And then she did the thing. She said, "Get your bag and get out." I honestly thought she was venting. She was not. She walked to the little room off the kitchen and she started putting my stuff in trash bags and she set them on the driveway. 16 years old, 4 months after my mother's funeral, standing on the driveway with 3 bags in January. Dennis watched from the window. I want to be clear about my head in that moment because the point of this whole post is that I never let it go and I'm not going to pretend I'm a bigger person than I am. I didn't cry it out and grow from it. Standing on that driveway, I made a decision that I have kept for 13 years. That woman was going to understand exactly what she did, in terms she couldn't argue her way out of, and I was going to be the one holding the receipts when it happened. I wasn't sad. I was planning. At 16 on a driveway with garbage bags. Nora took me that night. She had to. Half out of guilt and half because she was the trustee, and she'd just watched the kid she was legally supposed to be protecting get thrown out over the exact asset she was supposed to be protecting for him. That was the night Nora stopped being conflict avoidant about this one specific thing. She sat me down and told me the truth in full. The rental house was mine, held in trust, income and all, and that she'd been letting Lois collect off it to keep things smooth, and that she was done doing that. She started putting the rent into an account for me instead. Lois noticed the money stop within 2 months and called Nora screaming that Nora had turned her back on family. Nora told her the arrangement had never been hers to draw from. Lois refused to believe it. She kept insisting the house was part of what Dad left, that Nora and my dead mother had cooked up a scheme to cheat her. She has believed that loudly for over a decade. Now here's why I say I prepared instead of healed. I finished high school living with Nora. I did not go no contact in the dramatic sense. Lois and Dennis and I saw each other at the few family things that still happened. And every time, Lois made a comment that I'd landed on my feet by mooching off Nora, that I always did have someone else to sponge from. Dennis, as he got older, leaned into it harder, because Dennis's whole identity was being the son who stayed and took care of Mom. And I was the ingrate who got tossed and somehow still turned out fine, which annoyed him. Every one of those comments went in a drawer in my head. I didn't argue much at those dinners. I just watched. And I remembered. And I kept the one card I'd been holding since I was 16 very close to my chest. Because here's what Lois still doesn't grasp. And what Dennis definitely doesn't. Over these years, the rental income that was legally mine went into that account Nora set up. When I turned 25, the trust ended and everything transferred to me cleanly. The rental house. And every dollar of rent that had accrued in my name instead of being spent on Lois's groceries. 13 years of it. I let it sit. I never rubbed it in. I let Lois keep telling the family her version, that she'd generously raised her dead sister's ungrateful son and gotten nothing but accusations in return. And here's the part that turned a grudge into an actual plan. Lois, it turns out, has spent those same years living beyond that one house she inherited. She refinanced. She borrowed against the home she's so proud of, more than once, to keep up the lifestyle she thinks proves she's the successful sister. Dennis, who never launched, lives there with her rent-free. Nora, who still handles a lot of the family's practical paperwork because that's who Nora is, knows exactly what's on the house and how thin it all is. Nora didn't scheme anything. She just kept telling me the truth over the years, the way she always has. Because after that driveway, she decided I was the one she owed honesty to. So when Lois called me last month, first time reaching out to me directly in years, because Dennis had gotten himself into a jam, and suddenly the family needed to come together, and she opened with how she'd always been there for me. And family takes care of family. I want you to understand I was not shocked. I'd been waiting for a version of that call since I was 16. I had the account. I had the deed to a house she still thinks is somehow hers. And thanks to Nora, I knew exactly how exposed the house Lois lives in actually is, and exactly what it would take to be the one person standing between Lois and the street she once put me out on. I told her I'd think about helping. I told her I'd come by. I have not yet told her a single thing about what I own, what I've known, or what I've spent 13 years getting ready to do. That visit is part 2, and I need to know if I'm the monster here for how I'm planning to walk into that house. Update 1. First, thank you to everyone who read part 1. A lot of you told me I wasn't the monster for how I was planning to walk in there. A few of you said I should just take the win quietly and never look back. I want to be honest with those people. That was never going to be me. I've spent 13 years getting ready, and I wasn't going to spend it and then get cold feet on the porch. So here's the visit. Some background on the jam Dennis got into, because it's the thing that made Lois pick up the phone after years of only speaking to me through sideways comments at family gatherings. Dennis is 30 now and has never really moved out. He'd been running a small thing buying and flipping used cars off the lot behind the house Lois lives in, and he'd put money into it that wasn't his. Money borrowed against the house with Lois co-signing because Lois has always bankrolled Dennis while telling everyone she raised 2 hard-working kids. The flip business went nothing like Dennis promised. So now there's a payment schedule Lois can't meet on the second loan she took against her home, on top of the refinance she'd already done years ago to keep up appearances. That's the family coming together Lois suddenly discovered a need for. Not grief, not making things right, a due date she couldn't hit. I knew most of this before she called, because Nora still does the practical paperwork for half the family, and Nora has never lied to me since the night of the driveway. I want to keep being clear that Nora isn't scheming with me. Nora just answers my questions honestly, the way she decided she owed me back when I was 16, and she'd let Lois collect rent off my house for years out of cowardice. When I asked Nora how bad the house situation actually was, she told me plainly, bad, and getting worse, and Lois has no plan except leaning on family. So I went. It was a Thursday evening. I drove over in the Tacoma I bought with my own money. Parked in the same driveway she'd stacked my garbage bags on in January 13 years ago, and I stood there for a second in the exact spot before I went up and knocked. Dennis opened the door. He looked at the truck, then at me, and the first thing out of his mouth wasn't hello. It was a comment about how nice it must be to roll up in something like that while the rest of the family struggles. 13 years, and he opened on the exact same note. I didn't take the bait. I said I was there because Lois asked me to come. The house was smaller than I remembered and worse kept. Lois was at the kitchen table, the same table where she'd called me a parasite. And she did this thing where she stood up and opened her arms like we were close, like she'd been waiting to welcome me back into the fold. She told me family is family, that whatever happened when I was young was a hard time for everyone, that she'd been grieving her sister too, and maybe she wasn't perfect, but she'd kept a roof over my head when no one else would. I let her run through the whole speech. I've heard versions of it at every holiday, so I knew the beats. Roof over my head. Ungrateful. Hard time for everyone. She never once said she was sorry for the driveway. She reframed it as me being a difficult, grieving teenager and her doing her best. Then she got to the ask. She needed help with the house. Just for a little while. Family helps family, and I'd done well for myself, and she'd always known I would because she was the one who taught me to stand on my own 2 feet. That's the part that got me. She took credit for it. Putting a 16-year-old on the street in January was, in her retelling, the tough love that made me who I am. Dennis chimed in from the counter that I owed her, that she'd fed me for years and I'd never paid a cent back. And here was my chance to be a real member of this family for once. I asked her a simple question. I asked how much, and against what. And this is where I let a little of it out because I wanted to watch her try to answer. I asked if she meant the second loan on the house, the one she co-signed for Dennis's car flips, on top of the refinance from a few years back. Lois stopped. She wanted to know how I knew about any of that. Dennis got loud, demanding to know who'd been talking, and he looked right at the hallway like he already knew it was Nora. I didn't confirm anything. I just said that if the family was going to come together, I needed to understand what I'd be coming together around. So Lois, cornered, actually laid it out, because she wanted the money badly enough to be honest for once. The refinance from years ago, the second loan for Dennis, the payments she couldn't make. She framed all of it as bad luck and other people letting her down, never a decision she made. And then, and I want you to appreciate this, she pivoted straight back to the rental house. My house. She said that of course the family had assets, there was the other property that brought in rent, and it was time we stopped pretending about that too, that it had always really been family money, and if I was any kind of nephew, I'd let that income go towards saving the home she lived in. She said it like she was being generous by letting me contribute my own house to her problem. I asked her whose name she thought was on that rental. She said her father's estate, the family's, hers by rights as the older sister, and that Nora and my mother had cooked up some paperwork to cut her out, but everybody knew the truth. Same story she's told for 13 years. I asked her if she'd ever actually looked at the deed. She said she didn't need to look at anything, she knew her own family's business. Here's the thing I've been building to, and I only gave her the first inch of it. I told her calmly that the rental house has been legally mine since my mother arranged it before she died. Held in trust with Nora until I turned 25, and mine outright since. That every dollar of rent she thinks was family money has gone to me for years, into an account, and that I never spent a cent of it because I was saving it for something specific. I did not tell her yet what the something specific was. I let her sit with just that much. Dennis lost it first. He said I was lying, that there was no way, that his mother had managed that house his whole life. I told him he was welcome to look at the recorded deed himself. It's public. Anyone can pull it. That shut him up faster than anything. Because Dennis is not stupid. He's lazy and entitled, but he's not stupid. And he understood in about 2 seconds that if I was telling the truth, then the family asset they'd been counting on to help dig them out was never theirs and never would be. Lois went a different direction. She went to the grief. She said my mother would be ashamed of me, that Lois had given up years of her life for me, that this is the thanks. She told me I was showing my true nature, that she always knew I was cold, that I'd end up alone because I treat family like a transaction. And there it was, the die alone line. Again, 13 years later, at the same table. I told her I remembered the first time she said that to me, word for word, on the driveway, right before she bagged up my things. I asked if she remembered it. She said she never said any such thing, that I'd invented it, that I'd always had a flair for the dramatic like my mother. I didn't argue. Arguing about whether it happened is a trap. because she'll deny it forever, and I'd just be a guy insisting on a memory. What I did instead was tell her what I was actually prepared to do. And this is the part I want the subs read on. I told her I wasn't going to hand her rent money or pay her loans. But I told her I understood her situation was serious, and that there was a version of this where I helped in a way that protected the family home. I said it gently. I said, maybe there was a way to take the pressure off the house so nobody ended up on the street. Lois softened immediately. This was what she wanted to hear. The nephew coming around, family being family. She was already telling Dennis to put on coffee, already narrating to herself that she'd won me back. What I did not say out loud, and what I want to tell you, is what taking the pressure off the house actually means, and why I said it that way. Because I've had 13 years, and Nora's honesty and a full account of money that is legally, cleanly mine, and there is a completely legal path where the person who holds the note on Lois's house, the thing she can't pay, the thing that decides whether she keeps her home, stops being a faceless lender who might work with her and becomes me. The person she stood in a doorway and called a parasite. The person she said would die alone. I'm not going to explain the mechanism here yet because I'm still setting it up and I don't want to jinx it. And honestly, some of you are going to have opinions about whether I should do it at all. But I sat at that table, drank the coffee Dennis made, let Lois pat my hand and tell me she always knew I had a good heart under it all, and I let her believe help was coming. Then I said I needed a few weeks to move some things around, which was true. Just not the way she thought. Dennis walked me out to the truck. He couldn't help himself. He said low so Lois wouldn't hear, that if the house thing was real, the deed, then I'd been sitting on family money for years and I was the one who owed apologies. I told him the deed's been public the whole time and he could have read it any day of the last 13 years. Then I got in the truck and backed out of the driveway I got thrown out of. And I'll be honest with you, I sat at the stop sign at the end of the street for a minute because I'd waited so long for that drive out to feel like something. And it did. So that's where it stands. They think I'm coming to save the house. What I'm actually doing is putting myself in the one position where I decide whether Lois keeps it. Part 3 is the few weeks of moving things around. And it's where Nora and I had the one real fight of this whole thing. Because Nora helping me be honest is not the same as Nora being okay with what I'm about to do, and she made that very clear. Am I wrong for letting her think help is coming? Update 2. Okay, a lot happened between the kitchen table and where I am now, and I need to walk through it in order because the comments on the last update were split down the middle. Half of you were telling me to go for the throat. The other half were telling me that letting Lois think help was coming made me the bad guy, that I was setting her up. I read all of it. I want to explain what I actually did, because it's not as simple as walking in and buying her house out from under her. And the person who made sure I understood that was Nora. First, the mechanism, since I dodged it last time and a bunch of you correctly guessed anyway. When a person can't make the payments on a loan against their house, the loan doesn't just vanish, and the lender doesn't necessarily want to spend a year forcing someone out. A lot of the time they'd rather sell the debt itself to somebody willing to take it off their hands, usually for less than it's owed. Because getting most of it now beats chasing all of it later. That somebody can be an investor. It can. If the numbers line up and you're willing to do the legwork, be a private individual. It can be a nephew with 13 years of untouched rental income sitting in an account and a very specific reason to want to be the one holding the paper on a particular house. I'm not going to pretend I figured this all out alone at 16 on a driveway. I figured out the wanting to at 16. The how took years. And it took Nora, and it took me being an adult with actual money and actual patience. Which brings me to Nora, because I owe her a fuller picture than I've given you. Nora is not my accomplice. I keep saying that, and I mean it more every day. Nora was my mom's closest friend. She was the trustee who protected my house for years, even while she was too scared of Lois to stop her collecting the rent. And after the driveway, she decided the one thing she could give me was the truth, always, no matter who it embarrassed. That's the whole reason I know what I know. But there's a difference between telling me the truth about Lois's finances and being okay with what I wanted to do with that truth. And that difference turned into the one real fight of this entire thing. It happened at her kitchen. Nora's, not Lois's, on a Sunday afternoon. I'd come over to ask her a direct question, whether the note on Lois's house, the second loan Dennis's car flips had blown up, was the kind that could be sold, and to whom, and how a person would go about being that buyer. Nora knew immediately why I was asking. She put down the dish she was drying, and she asked me flat out if I was planning to buy my way into being the one who could take Lois's house. I said yes. I wasn't going to lie to the one person who never lied to me. And Nora, who has spent 13 years quietly on my side, told me she thought it was a mistake. Not illegal, she said, She was careful about that. She knew I'd never do anything that wasn't clean. But a mistake for me. She said she'd watched me carry this since I was a kid and she understood it. She of all people understood it. But that becoming the person who decides whether Lois lives on the street wasn't the same as being free of her. It was the opposite. It was tying myself to her forever, making her the center of my life the same way she'd made me the center of her resentment. She asked me what I thought I'd feel the day I actually did it, and whether I'd really believe it was worth 13 years. I want to be honest about how I took that, because it wasn't graciously. I told Nora that it was easy for her to talk about letting go when she wasn't the one bagged up and left on a driveway in January, when she was the adult in the room that day who could have stopped it, and instead let Lois collect rent off my house for years because she didn't want the fight. That was a cruel thing to say, and I knew it while I was saying it. Nora didn't flinch from it. She said I was right that she'd been a coward back then, that she'd carried it ever since, and that maybe that was exactly why she was begging me not to spend my life the way she'd spent a chunk of hers. Scared and quiet and going along. She said she'd give me every fact I asked for because she owed me that, but she would not tell me she thought this was good for me, because she didn't. And lying to make me feel better would just be a new version of the cowardice. We didn't resolve it. I want to be clear about that because a lot of these stories wrap the emotional stuff up in one conversation, and real life doesn't work like that. We left it raw. She gave me the information. The note was the kind that could be sold. The lender on Dennis's loan was exactly the type that offloads distressed paper, and the numbers were bad enough for Lois that they'd probably deal. And then she told me she loved me and thought I was making a choice I'd regret, both in the same breath, and I drove home angry at her for being maybe right. So here's what I did over the next few weeks. And none of it involved lying to anyone or breaking anything, because the whole point, the thing that makes this land, is that everything I did, Lois handed me by being who she is. I approached the lender holding the blown-up second loan the way any private buyer of distressed debt would. It's tedious and unglamorous and involves a lot of waiting and a lot of paperwork and, yes, a real amount of my own legitimate money, the rent, that was always mine. It took most of 3 weeks, and it very nearly fell apart twice over terms. But at the end of it, the note on the house Lois lives in, the one Dennis's car scheme couldn't cover, the one Lois co-signed, the one whose due date started this whole reunion, that note is now held by me. Legally, cleanly, boringly. The woman who put me on the street now owes her monthly payment to the nephew she called a parasite. She doesn't know it yet. As far as she's concerned, her generous nephew is moving things around to help the family. Meanwhile, Lois did not sit quietly and wait. This is where it got complicated, because Dennis started working on me in parallel, and Dennis is not stupid. He'd clearly gone and looked at the deed to my rental house after our last conversation, because he called me. I know. No plot advancing phone calls, but this one he genuinely made and I have to include it. And he'd shifted his whole approach. Gone was the "you owe us" routine. Now it was Dennis being reasonable, Dennis being my long-lost brother, Dennis floating the idea that since I clearly had resources and the rental house free and clear, maybe I'd want to actually buy Mom's house from the lender, keep it in the family, let her stay, and we could figure out the details as a family. He was trying to steer me toward exactly the position I was already quietly taking, except in his version, I'd be the sap who saves the house and lets them stay in it rent-free while they call it family unity. I let Dennis talk. I let him think it was his idea. Because here's the flaw in Dennis I've watched my whole life. Dennis always assumes he's the smartest person in the room and that everyone else is a mark. He was so busy maneuvering me into saving the house that it never occurred to him I might already own the reason they were desperate. He even got a little proud of himself, told me he'd always thought I'd come around, that blood is blood. I said maybe he was right. I said a lot of maybe and we'll see in those weeks. I'm not proud of how easy it was. The other thread I have to mention, because it's the human cost and I don't want to pretend there wasn't one, is that word got around the extended family that the nephew was going to save Lois's house, and suddenly people who hadn't spoken to me since I was a teenager were warm again. Tony, a cousin on that side who'd been firmly in Lois's camp my whole life and who'd laughed along at the mooch jokes at more than one holiday, started texting me like we were close, asking how I was doing, saying it was good to see family step up. I found that harder than Lois's insults. Honestly, the insults I was used to. The sudden fake warmth from people who watched me get thrown out and said nothing, that got under my skin in a way I wasn't ready for. I didn't tell any of them anything. I just watched the whole family rearrange itself around the money they thought was coming. And that's the part I keep turning over. The part Nora put in my head that I can't get out. Every single one of these people is being nice to me right now because they think I'm about to rescue Lois. They have no idea I'm the one holding the note. The day they find out, all this warmth flips, and I'll be the villain who let his own aunt lose her home. Never mind the driveway, never mind January, never mind 13 years. Nora warned me about exactly this. She said the family will never remember what Lois did to a 15-year-old whose mother just died. They'll only remember what I did to a woman in her 60s. And she's probably right. So now I'm sitting here holding the thing. The note's mine. Lois's next payment is due soon, the one she can't make, and for the first time in 13 years I'm the one who decides what happens next. Whether I quietly let her stay, whether I do to her exactly what she did to me, or something in between that I haven't fully let myself picture yet. She still thinks help is coming. Dennis still thinks he played me. Tony still thinks I'm the family hero. And Nora still thinks I'm going to regret every bit of it. Part 4 is the day I tell them. That's the one I've been waiting 13 years for. And now that it's here, I need to decide who I want to be when I walk back into that kitchen. What would you do? Final update. This is the last one. Thank you to everyone who followed this across a month of me typing out 13 years of my life. I read the comments on part 3, and they were more split than ever. A wall of people telling me to put her on the street the way she did to me, and a smaller but loud group quoting Nora back at me, telling me she'd already won if I built my whole life around her. I went into that kitchen carrying both of those voices. I'm going to tell you what I actually did and let you decide. I set the day myself. I told Lois I'd come over to sort out the house, and she took that to mean the rescue was finally happening, so she made it an occasion. When I got there, it wasn't just her and Dennis. Tony was there, the cousin who'd suddenly remembered he had a nephew once money was in the air. A couple of the other extended family people who'd gone warm on me were floating around too. Lois had set the kitchen table with the good stuff, like this was a celebration of family coming back together. She hugged me at the door and told everyone here he is, the one who never forgot where he came from. 13 years ago, she stood at that same door and put my things on the driveway. I hadn't forgotten where I came from. That was sort of the whole point. I want to walk through the conversation honestly because it did not go the clean way I'd played it in my head for over a decade. I'd imagined a single sentence that leveled her. Real life is messier and slower, and everybody talks over each other. I started by asking Lois to tell everyone, plainly, what the situation with the house actually was. The refinance, the second loan she co-signed for Dennis's car flips, the payment she couldn't make. I wanted it said out loud in front of Tony and the others, because they'd all been operating on Lois's version, which was that hard times had unfairly landed on a generous woman. She got through a sanitized version, still framing it as bad luck, before Dennis cut in trying to steer it toward the plan he thought was happening, that I was going to buy the note from the lender and keep the house in the family. Dennis actually said it out loud to the room, proud of himself, presenting it like he'd brokered the whole thing. He assumed he'd maneuvered me into being the rescuer. So I told them the truth, and I told it in order so there was no wriggle room. I said the lender had already sold the note weeks ago. Lois's face did something complicated. Relief first because to her that sounded like it was handled, like the family hero had come through quietly. She started to thank me, and I had to stop her and say the part she wasn't hearing. The note wasn't paid off. It was sold. It was bought. And the person who bought it, the person she now owed her monthly payment to, the person who now stood exactly where the lender used to stand on whether she keeps that house, was me. It took a second to land, and then it landed on everyone at once. Dennis got there first because Dennis, for all his laziness, understands money. He understood immediately that I hadn't saved anything, that I'd bought the leash. He started yelling that I'd tricked them, that I'd sat in this kitchen and let them believe I was helping. And I said, yes, I did exactly that. The way she let a 15-year-old believe he had a home for 4 months before she bagged up his things in January. Then came the reason, the thing I'd wanted said in front of witnesses for 13 years. Because Tony and the others in that room had spent my whole childhood swallowing Lois's story that she was a saint who took in an ungrateful boy. So I made her say why. I asked Lois, in front of all of them, to explain why she'd really thrown me out at 16. She tried the old lines. Hard time for everyone, difficult grieving teenager, tough love. And I kept pushing, calmly, until she cracked and said the true thing. The things she'd said to me once before and denied ever since. That my mother had always been the favorite, always been handed everything, got the house with the income while Lois got stuck with their father's old place. And that when my mother died and dumped her kid on Lois, every time she looked at me, she saw the sister who took what should have been hers. She said it in front of everyone. 13 years, I'd been called dramatic for remembering that. She said it herself, at her own table, with Tony sitting right there. That was the moment I'd actually been waiting for, not the money. The money was the tool. What I wanted was for the people who'd judged me my whole life to hear, from her own mouth, that she'd punished a grieving kid for the crime of being his mother's son. And they heard it. Now here's where I'm going to lose some of you. I did not put her on the street. I want to explain why. And I need you to understand it's not because I forgave her, because I did not. And it's not because I felt sorry watching her, because I mostly didn't. It's because of the thing Nora said in her kitchen that I couldn't get out of my head. That the day I actually threw a woman in her 60s out of her home, the whole family would forget the driveway forever. And I'd spend the rest of my life as the villain of a story that started with me being a bagged-up kid. And more than that, I'd be exactly what she always said I was. Cold. A person who treats family like a transaction. I would have proven her right about me to make her wrong about the house. That trade stopped being worth it somewhere in those 3 weeks. So here's what I actually did. And it's colder in its own way than eviction. I told Lois she could stay in the house. But every month she pays me. On time. In full. To me, by name. The nephew she called worthless writes the receipt on the roof over her head. And she has to look at that fact on the first of every month for as long as she lives there. I told her the rental house, the one she spent 13 years insisting was really hers, the one she tried to make me hand over to save her, stays mine, obviously, and she will never again refer to it as family money in my hearing. And I told her Dennis's little car operation gets none of my money. Not now, not ever. And if Dennis blows up her finances again, that's between her and the son she actually chose, because I'm not the family safety net. I'm the landlord now. Dennis called it disgusting, said I was holding his mother hostage. I told him she'd had 13 years to knock on Nora's door and say she was sorry to the kid she threw out. And instead, she spent them telling the family I was a mooch. Now she pays rent to the mooch. Tony didn't say much. Tony left early, and I noticed the warm texts stopped after that day, which tells you everything about what Tony's warmth was ever worth. Lois tried, at the end, when the room had thinned out, to go back to grief. My mother would be ashamed. I'd shown my true nature. I'd end up alone. The die alone line, a third time. The same words from the driveway and the same words from the first visit. And I told her the truth I'd finally figured out. Maybe I will end up alone, but if I do, it won't be because I'm cold. It'll be because the one adult who was supposed to catch me when my mom died taught me at 15 that family is just people who keep a tab on you, and I believed her. I told her she doesn't get to say that line to me a fourth time. Then I left through the front door instead of being carried out the side, and I drove home in the Tacoma, and I did not sit at the stop sign this time. I just went home. Nora and I are okay, mostly. She thinks I found the one version of this that doesn't eat me alive, and she might be right. Though she also still thinks I should sell the note to a stranger and walk away entirely so Lois isn't a monthly fixture in my life. Maybe someday. For now, keeping her paying me feels less like being chained to her and more like finally, after 13 years, being the one who sets the terms. I earned that at 16 on a driveway and I'm not giving it back. So that's it. She told me I was worthless and would die alone, and she put me out on the street. She never checked whose name was on the house she was so proud of, or the one she made me the tenant she always accused me of being. I didn't leave her to rot in the street like the title of my first post said I would. I decided that would have cost me more than it cost her. But every first of the month she remembers exactly who I am. That's enough. Thanks for reading. I'm done venting now.